So what we're gonna do today is I'm just gonna take you guys through the process of how I'm gonna build some Losi Baja Rey shocks, and all of the part numbers and links to these parts will be down in the description. We're gonna start out with the shock body and collar set. We got some shock ends, tops, and pistons. We have the shock shaft and hardware. We have the shock seal and limiters, and we got a full set of ball ends. This is a set of TLR Racing shock pliers that I picked up from A-Main Hobbies, and I think that this will make your life a lot easier if you intend to rebuild some shocks. I've had some really good luck using this TLR shock O-ring grease, and we are going to use that on the 2 O-rings and some of the shock parts. Today we're going to be using Team Losi Racing oils, and we have shock oils ranging from 25 all the way up into 45, and we do have one bottle of 27.5. And what I like to do is just put a piece of paper towel down so that I have a nice clean place to put all my parts, and we're just going to start with the shock collars. And we're busting out our shock ends, tops, and pistons. Opening up our shock shaft and hardware set. We're going to be building the front shocks first. We're going to take the longer shock parts and put them off to the side. And what I like to do is just start sourcing some of my parts. So each shock is going to require one collar and one piece for each. And I'm just going to start going through all the parts and putting one part and kind of laying out the shocks as they're built. We are going to be busting out the Losi manual digitally, and I will roll some of that footage into the video so you guys can see the exploded view of those shocks. And what I like to do is just lay out my shock pieces like this. We're going to take our shafts. And you'll notice that on these shafts, and we'll reference this manual piece, is that we have a threaded collar on the bottom, and then we have a stepped down version up top, and the stepped down part is what holds the piston, and this is what holds the rod end. There's these little micro clear O-rings, which are for the bleeder screws, so make sure you don't lose those. And then we're gonna grab 2 O-rings per shock, so a total of 4 of these medium O-rings. These are the shock cap O-rings, the large ones. We're gonna grab 2 of those, 4 of the mediums, and then 2 of the bleeder valve O-rings. This is pretty much how I like to lay out my parts, just so I could visualize and kind of go off of this exploded view. And if you guys need to lay out your parts to match the diagram view, then feel free to do that, but this works for me. So I'm gonna roll in some footage of the diagram right now with the manual and just double check that we have all the parts we need to build up the front shocks before we get on to the next step. Now's a good time to do a good visual inspection, and what I like to do is pull some of these pistons out and just inspect on the cast marks, and just kind of take my finger along the edge and make sure that there's no, noticeable cast or overcast marks. And if you do come across some overcast, like on this other piston, this one does have a little burr, just a little bit of burr, and I'll see if I can get that to come on camera. So if you can see right there, there's a little overcast on this piston, and this is what's going to be sliding up and down inside of that body. So we're going to just take a little X-Acto knife and see if we can clean that up a little bit. And you want to be extremely careful when you go to clean these up, because we don't want to mar the outside. So just the weight of the blade is pretty much all you need to do, because these parts will mate just from friction. But let's take this low-hanging fruit while we can, you know what I'm saying? A little bit better there. And let's get started. We're gonna take one of our front shock shaft sets and we're gonna start to prep. So we're gonna take one of these micro washers and we're gonna put that on top of the necked down version of the stem. So we have our full thread, and then we have the neck down on the shock shaft that goes up on top, like so. And just for consistency, I don't know if this is actually a thing, but there's a BB logo on one side of the pistons, and I'm always gonna mount that with the BB facing up on the shaft. So go ahead and take your piston, put it on top of the shaft, and then we're gonna take our lock nut, put that over the top, and we're just gonna start this by hand. So just to double check, we're gonna make sure we got our set washer, the piston, and then the lock nut. And this is where our fancy shock pliers come into hand. Oh, forgot to mention, and I am gonna use a small driver on the inside for that lock nut. Set our shaft right there, and I'm just using the 4mm one because it's been working. Let's set our shaft, got our driver, and we're just gonna send this home until it's a little bit tight. Do want to get a good squeeze on this thing, so. And then just inspect to make sure that you have all your threads taken up on the lock nut and that there's no side-to-side play when you pull on it. And we're gonna do both sides at the same time. So same thing, we're gonna take our shaft with the little small set washer with the piston washer. We're gonna set that on the neck down part, which is the top. And we're gonna take our piston with the BB logo facing up and set it on top of that washer. And we're gonna take our lock nut and just hand tighten that over the piston head. And same thing, double check, make sure we got our washer, piston, lock nut. Get our shock pliers and just give this a little tight. We're gonna take our shock body collars and we're gonna finally get a chance to use some of that shock O-ring grease. And this was something that I kind of had to look at the manual and kind of, look at these parts and just kind of look at it and go, okay, that's where they want this stuff. So I couldn't find a whole lot of info about how to do this, so I'm just gonna use my own experience with O-rings and try to prep this the way I have that I've had success with. So, and the way that I'm doing this is I'm just filling up this little channel with some of this shock O-ring grease. And I'm definitely not being conservative. I really want to pack it in there. And this might not be the right way to do it, but this is how I have been, so. And then I'm gonna set the first O-ring down into that grease. So we just packed it with grease and then set the O-ring inside of there. And we're gonna grab some more grease and just kind of double up that same pack. Now, not a whole lot this time, more of a thinner layer. We're gonna take our second O-ring and place it right on top, jam it in there, and then we're gonna give this a little spritz right on the edge, and then I'm just gonna take my finger and kind of work it on the edge and then try to get down, put a little bit of pressure, and I just put a little bit more back on the edge rib, and then we're gonna take our bottom cap and just go ahead and screw it on. And try not to over tighten this crazy because these O-rings will swell a little bit, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go all the way on and then come back just a little bit. And now's a good time just to double check one more time. Make sure you got your set washer, pistons right, and your lock nut is tight. And we're just gonna send the shaft through the body collar. Some of that excess is gonna come out the back right there, it's fine. I'm just gonna grab the cloth right there and just grab it. And then any excess off of the shaft right there. And then before I assemble anything else, I'm just gonna do a quick range of motion, and you want, even with no oil in there, you want very limited friction. So if you have a bunch of friction and it's not moving freely, then you probably want to go in there and re-trim out that piston. Just make sure that there's no burrs. Just kind of check everything over, make sure. But right now it's feeling pretty good. There's not a lot of friction. And while I don't recommend doing this, what I have been doing on these shocks for a long time is I actually will cut these limiters in half. And the reason I do that is because I'm not too concerned about bottoming out, and chassis slapping is just a part of RC. But if we think about how much travel, these shocks have, and if we cut this limiter in half, we're gaining, that's multiple inches of suspension travel. And I know that doesn't seem like much, but this right here, this amount out on the wheel extended travel is actually quite substantially more. So we're gonna throw our limiter on. We're gonna throw our half limiter on. We're gonna get our ball end. So this is a good time to put your ball end on. And one of the tricks to put the ball ends in is that if you find a driver that allows the ball end to go inside of it, it's a really good way to put the ball ends on. And we're just gonna take our ball, set it on the table with the ball facing up, take our rod end, this, and there we go. Ball end set. And we'll take that time, we'll do it to the other one. Just gonna set our ball down, set our rod in, driver, there we go. We'll do that to the top ones too. Take our shock pliers, and there might be a better way to do this, but I just start them by hand. It's kind of a pain in the ass sometimes, but and we're just gonna tighten this down. Repeating the steps that we did on that other shock, we're just gonna fill this body collar base with a little bit of shock O-ring grease. And we're gonna go through and just build up these rear shocks real quick. I'm just gonna go ahead and lay out all the parts just like we did on the fronts. We're gonna get a little bit of silicone oil on these two O-rings right here. So now that we got all these shocks built, we're gonna go ahead and fill them up with some oil. And we're choosing 27 weight Team Losi Racing oil, and we're just gonna fill these up with these shock shafts all the way down position. and fill them almost all the way up to the brim and then let them sit for about 20 minutes. And we took some of that 27 weight and filled them up pretty much all the way up to the top. So we're just gonna let these sit for a little bit, get some of the air bubbles out, and we might come back here and top off some of these, but we'll be back in a minute. All right, now that we've had these shocks sitting for a bit, what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab our shock collar, and you wanna run this just a couple of times just to make sure you don't got any air bubbles in there. And we're gonna take our collar set, and now's a good time that we're gonna prep the O-ring around this little bleeder screw. What we're gonna wanna do here is actually just bleed this out so that we're gonna create a dead shock, or what's known as a zero rebound shock. I'm gonna keep the shock pointed at a backwards angle, and then I'm gonna run the shaft up until we start to bleed some of that oil out of the bleeder while maintaining this rearward angle. And I'm just slowly running the shock shaft all the way up, and eventually we'll see some fluid, there it is, start to peak up. So the shock shaft is almost fully compressed, and what we want to do is run it all the way to the bump stop as we're still bleeding fluid. So we're running all the way to the bump stop. Once we get to the bump stop, let it sit there. Gonna grab our bleeder screw, and while maintaining this angle, put a little bit of pressure. And when you're done building these shocks, should have a smooth functioning shock that has very minimal, almost zero rebound. When it comes out, it should just basically be sitting there dead. So I'm happy with that. I'm moving on to the next one. Just make sure this O-ring's seated down this little channel right here. And we're just gonna prep our bleeder screw with that little clear O-ring. We will set that in our driver. We're just gonna run this shaft all the way through its full range of motion. And eventually, there's the oil right there purging. So it completely bottoms out. And we're gonna put in the bleeder screw. Be careful not to over tighten so that that little grom doesn't squeeze out the sides. And we have another dead shock. Smooth action. Moving on to the rear shocks, we're gonna prep our little bleeder screw with that clear O-ring and preset it on the driver. Grab our rear shock, grab our cap, make sure our O-ring is seated in there. We're just gonna run the shaft up, bleed out the excess oil. Here, we're just gonna bleed this last little bit. Put in our bleeder screw. And same thing, we're just gonna run the shock up and down. Once it gets back, it shouldn't bounce back out, showing that it's overfilled. So that's how you build a dead shock, zero rebound. And boom, we nailed it first try. Built another shock, zero rebound, or what they call dead shock. And that's how I build my Baja Rey shocks. You guys have a good one. Take it easy. Peace.